In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died as the richest man in America. His fortune of $100 million was larger than the entire United States Treasury. 1 out of every $20 in circulation belonged to him. His son William Henry doubled that fortune in just 8 years. The Vanderbilts seemed unstoppable. They built mansions that rivaled European palaces. They threw parties that cost more than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. They dominated New York society, American business, and the railroad industry that powered the nation. And then something went wrong. Most people assume the Gilded Age ended because of the income tax in 1913, or the First World War, or the Great Depression. But by the time any of these events occurred, the Vanderbilt fortune had already begun to crumble. Within 3 decades of the Commodore's death, not a single Vanderbilt remained among America's wealthiest families. This is not a story about taxes or economic downturns. This is the story of how the richest family in America engineered their own collapse. Through spending that defied comprehension. Through competition that destroyed rather than built. Through daughters who carried fortunes to Europe and never returned. Through sons who learned to spend but never to earn. If you think you know how the Gilded Age ended, you might be surprised. The collapse started from within, long before any external force intervened. Like this video and subscribe to follow the complete story of how America's greatest fortune vanished. Let us begin with what nobody wants to talk about. Chapter 1: The Collapse Nobody Talks About. When the Commodore died in January 1877, newspapers devoted entire editions to his passing. The man who had built empires in shipping and railroads left behind a fortune that seemed almost impossible to lose: $100 million. At a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 a year, Cornelius Vanderbilt possessed more wealth than the federal government itself. His son William Henry inherited the bulk of this fortune and promptly doubled it. By 1885, when William Henry died from a stroke during a business meeting, the Vanderbilt fortune had grown to approximately $200 million. That figure represented roughly $6.5 billion in today's money. William Henry Vanderbilt was, at the moment of his death, the wealthiest person in the world. So what happened? The conventional explanation points to external forces. The income tax arrived in 1913. World War I disrupted markets. The 1920s brought speculation and excess, followed by the devastating crash of 1929. According to this narrative, the great fortunes of the Gilded Age were swept away by historical forces beyond anyone's control. But this explanation has a problem. The timeline does not match. According to Arthur Vanderbilt II, a descendant who studied his family's decline, the Vanderbilts had fallen off the list of America's wealthiest families within 30 years of the Commodore's death. That means by roughly 1907, before the income tax, before the war, before the crash. Other wealthy families that the Commodore would have considered rivals or even beneath him, families like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, were still ascending. John Rockefeller would become America's first billionaire around 1916. Yet the Vanderbilts, who had once controlled more wealth than anyone in the nation, had already faded. Something else was happening. Something internal. Consider the physical evidence. The Commodore himself lived modestly, occupying a relatively simple home on Washington Place in Manhattan. He had no interest in displaying his wealth through architecture or parties. His focus remained entirely on building, acquiring, and expanding. When he donated $1 million to establish Vanderbilt University in Nashville, it represented his only major philanthropic gesture. But his children and grandchildren had different priorities. By the 1880s, the Vanderbilts had begun constructing mansions on Fifth Avenue that rivaled anything in Europe. 10 grand houses would eventually line the avenue, each more elaborate than the last. The Commodore's son, William Henry, built a triple palace that occupied an entire city block. His grandchildren competed to outdo one another with ever more extravagant residences. Here is the telling detail. These mansions were demolished within 70 years of the Commodore's death. The Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue, built by William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva in 1882, was sold to a real estate developer in 1926 and torn down the following year. The massive home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II at 57th Street met the same fate that same year, replaced by the Bergdorf Goodman department store. The Triple Palace survived until the 1940s before giving way to commercial development. These were not houses seized by creditors or destroyed by fire. The family simply could not afford to keep them. While the Vanderbilts were building palaces, other tycoons were building something different. John Rockefeller, who founded Standard Oil in 1870, took a fundamentally different approach to wealth. He lived relatively modestly. He reinvested profits systematically. Most importantly, he established family trusts and governance structures designed to preserve wealth across generations. The Rockefellers remain wealthy today, more than a century later. The family's collective fortune reportedly exceeds $10 billion, spread among roughly 200 descendants. They created foundations, established investment offices, and built institutional structures that outlasted any individual. The Vanderbilts built houses. This is not to say the Rockefellers were superior people or made morally better choices, but they understood something the Vanderbilts did not. Wealth that consumes itself cannot survive. By 1973, when approximately 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion, contemporary accounts suggest that few, if any, among them could claim significant wealth. The Commodore's fortune, once the largest in America, had effectively vanished in less than a century. The causes of this collapse were multiple and interconnected. The Commodore himself bears significant responsibility. He built an empire, but never built the people who would inherit it. His sons received criticism rather than education. His daughters were considered irrelevant once they married and changed their names. The business knowledge accumulated over decades died with him. But there were also choices made by those who came after. Choices about houses and parties, choices about sons and daughters, choices about who to marry and what to value. In the chapters ahead, we will examine each of these factors. We will see how the Vanderbilts competed themselves into ruin through mansion building that served no practical purpose. We will follow the daughters who carried enormous dowries to European aristocrats who needed American cash. We will meet the heirs who squandered fortunes on horses and gambling. Most importantly, we will discover how the very system the Vanderbilts built to display their prominence became the engine of their destruction. Chapter 2. The Commodore's Fatal Mistake. The Commodore built two empires, first in steamships, then in railroads. He crushed competitors, manipulated markets, and accumulated more money than any American before him. But he failed completely at the one task that would have secured his legacy. He never taught his children how to handle wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt had 13 children with his first wife, Sophia. Of these, only 2 were sons who survived to adulthood: William Henry, the eldest, and Cornelius Jeremiah, born 9 years later. The patriarch treated both with contempt. William Henry was a quiet, sickly child who showed little of his father's ferocious ambition. The old man called him a blockhead, a blatherskite, names that William carried into adulthood, never quite believing he deserved respect. When William chose to marry Maria Louisa Kissam, the daughter of a poor Brooklyn minister, his father was furious. He considered the match beneath the family and banished his son to a 70-acre farm on Staten Island. The exile was meant as punishment. William was expected to fail, confirming the low opinion his father held. Instead, he transformed the rocky farmland into a profitable operation. He worked the soil himself. He learned to manage accounts, negotiate with suppliers, and turn a profit from difficult circumstances. For over a decade, William proved himself on that Staten Island farm, while his father built railroad empires without him. The younger son, Cornelius Jeremiah, faced an even harder fate. At 18, he began suffering from epilepsy. The Commodore, who saw any weakness as moral failure, interpreted the seizures as proof of mental instability. He would reportedly tell friends that his son had a cog out, that he would give $100 if the boy had never been named Cornelius. When the younger son tried to make his own way to California during the gold rush, He ran out of money and charged his expenses to his father. The patriarch responded by having his own child arrested and committed to the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. The asylum records noted the form of mental disorder as dementia, supported by father. This was not an isolated incident. The Commodore had previously committed his own wife, Sophia, to the same institution when she refused to move from Staten Island to Manhattan. He saw confinement not as treatment, but as punishment for disobedience. After his release, Cornelius Jeremiah drifted through various occupations: law clerk, leather merchant, farmer, revenue agent. Nothing held his interest or earned approval. He developed gambling habits and reportedly borrowed money against the family name without paying it back. His father eventually bought him a fruit farm in Connecticut, hoping never to see him again. The contrast between the Commodore's business genius and his parenting became starkly apparent in his will. When he died in 1877, he left the vast majority of his estate to William Henry. His 8 daughters each received $200,000, a tiny fraction of the total. Cornelius Jeremiah received $300,000, with the explicit understanding that he could not be trusted with more. The excluded children sued. The trial dragged on for over a year and drew national press attention. William eventually settled with his siblings, paying each sister an additional $500,000. But the damage to family relationships proved permanent. Cornelius Jeremiah contested the will alongside 2 of his sisters. He lost. 5 years later, in April 1882, he took his own life at the Glenham Hotel in Manhattan. He was 51 years old. The New York Times obituary called him the discarded son of the late Commodore Vanderbilt. What the old man never understood was that his own behavior created the failures he despised. William Henry succeeded not because of his father's guidance, but despite the constant belittling. The lessons William learned came from exile on a Staten Island farm, not from any instruction in business or wealth management. A turning point came in 1860 when father and son took a voyage together to Europe aboard the steamship Vanderbilt. Something happened between New York and Naples. The words they exchanged remain unknown, but when they returned, the Commodore finally acknowledged his eldest son's abilities and began involving him in the family business. By then, William Henry was nearly 40 years old. He had spent 2 decades proving himself while his father refused to see. The stubbornness had cost the family precious time that could have been spent preparing the next generation for the responsibilities ahead. Even William's late redemption came with limitations. He learned railroads and business strategy, but he never learned how to teach his own children. The pattern would repeat. William Henry's sons would inherit vast sums but little understanding of how to preserve them. The Commodore's treatment of his sons created a template that would echo through generations. William Henry learned business through exile and necessity, not through mentorship. When he finally gained approval, he was already middle-aged. He had spent his formative years proving himself worthy, rather than learning how to guide those who would come after him. What would William Henry's children learn from watching their father struggle for decades under the patriarch's contempt? They learned that money came through inheritance, not effort. They learned that the family business was a source of anxiety, not opportunity. And they learned that Vanderbilt wealth existed to be displayed, not preserved. The mansions that would soon line Fifth Avenue were the physical expression of these lessons. Chapter 3: The Mansion Wars. The Commodore built railroads, his children built houses, and in doing so, they transformed inherited wealth into limestone and marble that would consume millions without generating a single dollar in return. The competition began almost immediately after William Henry's death in 1885. His estate, divided among his widow and 8 children, provided each heir with sums that would have seemed inexhaustible to any reasonable person. His eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, each inherited roughly $50 million. Their sisters received between $5 and $10 million each. Any sensible family might have invested these fortunes conservatively and lived comfortably for generations. The Vanderbilts chose a different path. They would spend their way to social prominence, and the battlefield would be Fifth Avenue. William Kissam and his wife Alva fired the first shot. In 1878, they commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a residence at 660 Fifth Avenue. Hunt had trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. He brought European sophistication to American clients who desperately wanted it. Alva collaborated with Hunt obsessively for 4 years. She saw herself not as a client, but as a creative partner. The result was the Petit Chateau, a French Renaissance confection clad in gleaming white Indiana limestone that stood in stark contrast to the drab brownstone surrounding it. The project employed over 40 artisans for the stonework alone. Contemporary estimates place the total cost at approximately $2 million, equivalent to roughly $60 million today. The house was completed by late 1882. Alva had achieved exactly what she intended. Every wealthy family in New York now knew that the Vanderbilts had arrived, and that they possessed both the resources and the taste to build something magnificent. Across the street, William Henry had been watching. He hired architects John B. Snook and Charles Atwood to construct what the press would call the Triple Palace at 640 Fifth Avenue. This massive brownstone complex stretched along the avenue, housing William Henry and 2 married daughters under connected roofs. More than 600 laborers worked on the project, which cost approximately $2 million. But these were merely opening moves. Cornelius II, William Henry's eldest surviving son, had inherited the largest share of his father's estate. He also inherited a sense of obligation. As the senior male Vanderbilt of his generation, he believed it was his duty to maintain the family's position at the very pinnacle of American society. His wife Alice shared this conviction with even greater intensity. She reportedly invented a coat of arms for the family and had it carved into the stone entryway of their new home. In 1883, Cornelius commissioned George B. Post to design a residence where Fifth Avenue met 57th Street. The original structure was impressive enough, a red brick and limestone townhouse that announced serious money. But within a decade, Cornelius grew alarmed. Other robber baron families were building on Fifth Avenue. Their houses were getting larger. He felt that rivals were trying to eclipse him. His response was dramatic. He purchased every remaining lot on his block, then rehired Post and brought in Richard Morris Hunt to expand the residence into something that would dwarf all competition. Hundreds of workers labored day and night. The expansion cost approximately $3 million, equivalent to over $90 million today. When completed in 1893, the house contained 130 rooms. It stretched the full length of the block front, the largest private residence New York had ever seen. But even this was not enough. In Newport, Rhode Island, the summer colony where wealthy New Yorkers escaped the heat, another front opened in the Mansion Wars. William Kissam and Alva had commissioned Hunt to build Marble House, a Beaux-Arts palace that cost $11 million. $7 million of that sum went to marble alone. Marble House was completed in 1892. That same year, a fire destroyed the wooden summer cottage that Cornelius and Alice owned on nearby Ochre Point. Here was an opportunity. Cornelius could rebuild, and he could surpass his younger brother's showpiece. He commissioned Hunt yet again. This time, the architect created the Breakers, an Italian Renaissance palazzo of 70 rooms overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The structure used steel trusses and Indiana limestone with no wooden framing anywhere to prevent another fire. 2,000 workers labored in shifts around the clock to complete the project in just 2 years. The cost exceeded $7 million, equivalent to somewhere between $150 and $220 million today. The Breakers was 3 times the size of the White House. Hunt considered it his masterpiece. He died in Newport in 1895 while supervising the finishing touches. Consider what the family had spent in just over a decade. The Petit Chateau, the Triple Palace, the expanded Cornelius Mansion, Marble House, the Breakers. Adding Newport and New York properties together, the 2 brothers and their father had consumed tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions in modern terms, on structures that generated no income and required enormous staffs to maintain. The Breakers alone needed 33 indoor servants and 25 groundskeepers. Its boilers consumed 150 tons of coal annually. property taxes eventually reached $83,000 per year, a sum that would strain even substantial resources. And the two brothers were not alone. Other Vanderbilt heirs constructed their own monuments elsewhere in the country. The pattern was always the same. Each property had to exceed what came before. Each house required more elaborate interiors, more imported materials, larger staffs, higher maintenance costs. The family was engaged in a competition with no finish line, spending faster than even their substantial inheritances could sustain. What none of them seemed to recognize was the fundamental absurdity of their situation. They were building palaces designed to last centuries for a social position that required constant reinforcement. European aristocrats inherited castles along with the titles and lands that supported them. The Vanderbilts had only money, and money, unlike land or title, can disappear. The architect Richard Morris Hunt gave them chateaux and palazzos. He could not give them the stable social structures that made such buildings sensible in Europe. In France, a chateau represented generations of accumulated prestige. In America, it represented only the ability to write a very large check. The Vanderbilts had learned to build monuments. They had not learned to ask whether monuments were what they needed. Chapter 4. The Price of Admission. The mansion was finished. Now Alva needed to fill it with the right people. In 1883, New York society operated according to rules as rigid as any European court. At the apex sat Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, a woman who preferred to be called simply Mrs. Astor, as though no other Mrs. Astor could possibly matter. Together with Ward McAllister, a self-appointed arbiter of social taste, she maintained an invisible boundary around acceptable society. Their famous list of 400 supposedly represented every family worth knowing in New York. The number was said to match the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The Vanderbilts were not on the list. Mrs. Astor found railroad money distasteful. The Commodore's rough manners and coarse language were still remembered. His grandson William Kissam might be perfectly respectable, but his wife Alva was pushy and calculating in ways that made old money uncomfortable. Mrs. Astor had never called on Alva at her new home, which in the elaborate etiquette of the era meant she did not acknowledge that Alva existed. Alva decided to force the issue. She announced plans for a costume ball to celebrate her new residence. The date would be March 26th, just after Lent, when no other hostess would dare compete. She sent out more than 1,000 invitations. She invited journalists to preview the decorations before the event, ensuring that newspapers would report on the preparations for weeks. Anticipation built across the city. The ball became the only topic of conversation in drawing rooms throughout Manhattan. Every young woman of marriageable age desperately wanted an invitation. According to a story that became legend, Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's youngest daughter, had been practicing a quadrille with her friends for weeks, rehearsing the elaborate group dance they would perform at the ball. One by one, her friends received their invitations. Carrie's never arrived. When the distraught girl asked her mother to investigate, Alva supposedly delivered her calculated response. She could not possibly send an invitation to Mrs. Astor. After all, Mrs. Astor had never called on her. One did not send invitations to strangers. Whether the story is precisely true or not, the outcome is documented. Mrs. Astor ordered her carriage to the new Vanderbilt mansion and left her calling card with the butler. The following day, an invitation arrived at the Astor residence. On the evening of March 26th, carriages began arriving at 10 in the evening. Police struggled to control the crowds that had gathered on Fifth Avenue, straining to glimpse the costumes as guests stepped from their carriages. Nearly 1,200 people streamed through the doors wearing outfits that had consumed months of preparation and fortunes in materials. The host appeared as the Duc de Guise. Alva herself wore a gown inspired by a painting by the French artist Alexandre Cabanel, presenting herself as a Venetian princess in white and yellow brocade, shading from deep orange to pale canary. Gold embroidery covered the blue satin train. Pearls that had supposedly belonged to Catherine the Great stretched across her waist. But Alva did not claim the most memorable costume of the evening. That distinction went to her sister-in-law Alice, wife of Cornelius II. Alice appeared as Electric Light. The gown was a creation of Charles Frederick Worth, the most celebrated couturier in Paris. White satin shimmered with glass beads arranged in lightning bolt patterns. In her raised hand, Alice carried a torch that actually illuminated, powered by a battery concealed somewhere in the costume. She looked like the Statue of Liberty brought to life, a walking advertisement for the modern age. The newspapers went wild. Alice had upstaged Alva at her own party. The dancing continued until sunrise. Men in powdered wigs stumbled down Fifth Avenue in the morning light, passing children on their way to school. The fantasy world Alva had created dissolved with the dawn, but its effects lingered. Mrs. Astor reportedly acknowledged afterward that the time had come for the Vanderbilts. Contemporary accounts placed the total cost of the evening at approximately $250,000. This included $65,000 for champagne and catering, $155,000 for costumes, $11,000 for flowers, and $4,000 for hairdressing. In modern terms, the family spent somewhere between $6 and $7 million on a single party. Consider what that money purchased. Not land, not investments, not anything that would generate returns or appreciate in value. The Vanderbilts spent $6 million to prove they belonged in rooms where they had not previously been welcome. They bought admission to a social circle that would accept them only because they demonstrated the ability to spend recklessly. This was the lesson the family had learned. Status came from display. Respect came from excess. The way to overcome the stigma of new money was to spend so flamboyantly that old money could not ignore you. The ball worked. Alva achieved everything she intended. The Vanderbilts were now part of society, but the victory came with a hidden cost that no one tallied at the time. The family had established a pattern that would prove impossible to break. Each generation would need to spend more than the last. Each house would need to surpass the previous one. Each party would need to exceed what came before. Mrs. Astor's 400 maintained their position through restraint and exclusivity. They understood that scarcity created value. The Vanderbilts had forced their way in through abundance, and abundance requires constant replenishment. Wealth came from providing services others would pay for. Reputation apparently came from spectacular disposal of that wealth. Chapter 5. Selling the Daughter. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old in 1895. She had grown into what contemporaries called a great beauty, with dark eyes, a swan-like neck, and a delicate oval face that made playwright James Barrie declare he would stand all day in the street just to watch her step into a carriage. She was intelligent enough to pass entrance examinations for both Oxford and Cambridge. She was worth approximately $20 million, and the entire country knew it. She was also, despite these advantages, entirely without power over her own future. Consuelo had fallen in love with Winthrop Rutherford, a handsome American from an established family. They became secretly engaged. When her mother discovered the relationship, she destroyed it through methods that would later be described under oath as coercion. The replacement suitor was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was 23 years old and master of Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest estates in England. He was also nearly bankrupt. The agricultural depression had devastated his income. The palace required massive investment simply to remain habitable. The Duke needed American money, and he was willing to marry for it. The Duke had a nickname. They called him Sonny, not for his disposition, but for his secondary title, Earl of Sunderland. By most accounts, his personality matched the English weather more than the name suggested. The courtship was brief and functional. The Duke visited Newport in the summer of 1895. He proposed in September. By Consuelo's account, he approached the matter like a soldier completing an assignment rather than a man in love. He had given up a woman he cared for back in England. This was business. The wedding took place on November 6th at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. Police struggled to control thousands of onlookers, mostly women, desperate to glimpse the bride. The ceremony was delayed 20 minutes because Consuelo had been weeping so heavily that her face was swollen. She stood at the altar with tears streaming behind her veil. The financial terms were precise. The The Duke received $2.5 million in railroad stock, equivalent to more than $90 million today. Consuelo's father also provided an annual income of $100,000 to each spouse for life. This money would restore Blenheim and maintain the Duke in appropriate style. In exchange, Consuelo received a title. She became the Duchess of Marlborough. The transaction was complete. The term for women like Consuelo was dollar princess. Dozens of American heiresses made similar exchanges during this era, trading fortunes for coronets, funding the renovation of crumbling British estates in return for admission to aristocratic circles. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 100 American women married into the British peerage, bringing an estimated £25 million across the Atlantic. Consuelo was simply the most prominent example. The marriage delivered exactly what its terms promised and nothing more. The Duke reportedly told Consuelo early on that the only reason he had married her was to save his house. They produced 2 sons, securing the succession, then lived increasingly separate lives. The Duchess threw herself into charitable work and, eventually, the women's suffrage movement. They separated in 1906 and divorced in 1921. The annulment proceedings years later produced a remarkable document. Consuelo's mother, now remarried and calling herself Alva Belmont, provided testimony to a church investigator. Her statement was blunt. She had forced her daughter to marry the Duke. She had always had absolute power over her daughter. The confession confirmed what everyone had suspected. The wedding had been a sale. The Vanderbilt fortune had purchased a title, and the title had cost a young woman her chance at happiness. Consider what the family had accomplished across 3 generations. The Commodore built an empire through relentless acquisition. His son spent freely but at least doubled what he inherited. The grandchildren converted wealth into houses and social position. And now the great-grandchildren were being converted into currency themselves, exchanged for aristocratic connections that brought prestige but generated nothing. The Vanderbilt money flowed to Blenheim Palace, where it restored rooms and maintained grounds and supported a duke who openly resented his American wife. The annual payments continued for decades. The capital never returned. This was not an investment. This was dispersal. Chapter 6. The Arithmetic of Division. Cornelius Vanderbilt II left an estate valued at $73 million when he died in September 1899. His father had left him approximately $70 million in 1885. After 14 years, the number was nearly identical. The houses and the horses in the Newport summers had consumed whatever the investments produced. The terms of his will revealed something more troubling than stagnation. The family was tearing itself apart over money. Cornelius had 7 children. His eldest son, William Henry II, had died of typhoid fever while attending Yale in 1892. His second son, also named Cornelius but called Neely, had committed what his father considered an unforgivable sin. In 1896, Neely had married Grace Graham Wilson, the daughter of a New York banker. His parents objected. The reasons were never made entirely clear, but the Wilson family, though respectable, was not quite at the level the Vanderbilts now considered appropriate. When Neely married anyway, his father altered his will. The distribution was brutal. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the third son, received approximately $37 million and the gold medal that Congress had awarded to the Commodore in 1864. This heirloom had come to symbolize leadership of the family. Whoever held it was understood to be the Vanderbilt patriarch. Neely received $1.5 million. His sisters Gertrude and Gladys each received more than $7 million. His brother Reginald received the same. The disparity was so extreme that Alfred, apparently embarrassed, gave Neely $6 million from his own share. But the message had been delivered. Marry without approval and you would be cast out. The punishment solved nothing. The fortune was still divided. $73 million became 7 separate inheritances, each smaller than the whole, each subject to the spending habits of its new owner. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the principal heir, the man who held the Congressional Medal, boarded the RMS Lusitania on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool on business. 6 days later, a German torpedo struck the ship off the coast of Ireland. By multiple accounts, Alfred helped other passengers into lifeboats and gave his own life jacket to a woman with a child. His body was never recovered. He was 37 years old. His fortune passed to his sons, divided again. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, the youngest brother, had different problems. He drank heavily and gambled compulsively. The horse track consumed substantial sums. He died in 1925 at 45, leaving behind a young daughter named Gloria and an estate far smaller than it should have been. Gloria Vanderbilt would later become famous in her own right. Her fame came from reinventing herself as a fashion designer and artist, not from inherited wealth. By the time she came of age, there was little left to inherit. The mathematics were unforgiving. One fortune divided among children produces smaller fortunes. Those smaller fortunes divided again produce smaller ones still. Within 2 generations, the concentrated wealth that had seemed inexhaustible was scattered across dozens of heirs, none of whom possessed enough to maintain what their grandparents had built. The family had constructed houses meant to last centuries. They had made no provision for the simple reality that wealth divided is wealth diminished. Chapter 7. What Remains? Gloria Vanderbilt died in June 2019 at the age of 95. She was the last person to carry the Vanderbilt name as a direct descendant of the Commodore. Her son was at her bedside. That son was Anderson Cooper, the CNN journalist. He had grown up in Manhattan, attended Yale, built a career entirely on his own work. When asked about his family's history, he described the effect of inherited wealth as corrosive, cancerous even. He told interviewers that his mother had made clear there would be no trust fund waiting for him, and he was grateful for it. Inherited money, Cooper said, is an initiative sucker, a curse. Who has inherited a lot of money and gone on to do things in their own life? The question answered itself. The Vanderbilt story provided the evidence. Gloria herself had understood this. Though she inherited money as a child, she spent her adult life building something of her own. She became a fashion designer, an artist, an author. The genes that bore her name in the 1970s and 80s generated more income than any trust fund. She made herself into something other than an heiress. Her net worth at death was reportedly around $10 million. A comfortable sum, but a rounding error compared to what her great-great-grandfather had accumulated. The largest fortune of the Gilded Age had become, over 5 generations, a modest estate. Cooper wrote a book about his ancestors in 2021. He called it Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. The title told the story plainly: rise and fall. Not rise and continuation. Not rise and transformation. Fall. In the book's pages, Cooper described touring the empty rooms of mansions his family had built, standing in spaces designed to announce permanent arrival, but now operated as museums, or, more often, replaced by office towers. He wrote about the spending that seemed normal to people born into it. They thought it would last forever. It did not last forever. It barely lasted a century. The Commodore started with nothing and built an empire. His son expanded what he inherited. His grandsons converted wealth into spectacle. His great-grandsons divided what remained until there was nothing substantial left to divide. What went wrong? The answer is not complicated. The Commodore built a business. His descendants built monuments to themselves. He created systems that generated wealth. They created displays that consumed it. He thought in terms of railroads and shipping lines and market share. They thought in terms of ballrooms and guest lists and European titles. The shift happened gradually, then completely. By the 3rd generation, being a Vanderbilt had become the family business. Maintaining the name, the houses, the social position required full-time attention and unlimited funds. There was no time left for building anything new. Each generation received its share outright and spent it outright. The money flowed out faster than it could possibly flow in. No structure existed to prevent any single heir from consuming their portion entirely. No governance separated the family's long-term interests from any individual's short-term desires. Anderson Cooper, born into the family's long shadow, chose a different path. He built a career. He earned his own money. He explicitly rejected the idea that inheritance was desirable. The inheritance he did receive was the story itself, the cautionary tale, the evidence of what happens when wealth becomes an end rather than a means. His great-great-great-grandfather started with $100 borrowed from his mother and built something that lasted. His mother started with a famous name and built something of her own. The pattern that worked was not inheritance. It was work. The name survives primarily in universities and museums and history books. The fortune does not survive at all. What remains is the lesson. Wealth is not a permanent condition. It must be actively maintained, carefully structured, and purposefully directed, or it will disappear within a few generations, remembered only in photographs of houses that no longer stand. The Vanderbilts learned this lesson too late. Perhaps others can learn it from them. Chapter 8. The Heirs Who Squandered Everything. Cornelius Vanderbilt II left behind $73 million when he died in 1899. The distribution of that money would shatter the family. His eldest surviving son, Cornelius III, had committed what his father considered an unforgivable offense 3 years earlier. He had married Grace Graham Wilson, the daughter of a New York banker, without parental approval. The family considered the Wilsons respectable but not quite suitable. When Neely married anyway, his father suffered a stroke the same day. Whether cause and effect or coincidence, the patriarch drew the obvious conclusion. He changed the terms of his inheritance. Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, the third son, received approximately $37 million and the Congressional Gold Medal that had been awarded to the Commodore in 1864. This heirloom had come to symbolize leadership of the family. Whoever held it was understood to be the Vanderbilt patriarch. Neely received $1.5 million. His sisters Gertrude and Gladys each received more than $7 million. His brother Reginald received the same. Alfred, apparently embarrassed by the disparity, gave his brother $6 million from his own share. But the damage extended beyond money. The family had demonstrated that it valued obedience over loyalty. Alfred seemed positioned to lead the Vanderbilts into the new century. He was handsome, athletic, passionate about horses and the gentleman's sport of coaching. He inherited wealth and social standing. He did not inherit any particular talent for building either. His first marriage ended in divorce in 1908. The settlement cost $10 million. He remarried and continued his expensive pursuits. When war erupted in Europe, he booked passage to England on business. The ship was the RMS Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, a German torpedo struck the vessel off the coast of Ireland. Alfred helped other passengers into lifeboats. He gave his life jacket to a woman holding a child. When the ship went down, he went with it. His body was never recovered. He was 37 years old. His fortune passed to his sons, divided again. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, the youngest brother, made Alfred's spending look restrained. On the night of his 21st birthday, celebrating his inheritance of approximately $15 million, he lost $70,000 at the gambling table. It was an announcement of intent. His interests were horses and alcohol. He frequented racetracks where he lost substantial sums. He drank brandy milk punches with a dedication that alarmed his doctors. By his early 40s, they were warning him that continued drinking would kill him. He continued drinking. In 1923, at 42 years old, Reginald married Gloria Morgan. She was 17. The age gap raised eyebrows even in an era accustomed to unconventional arrangements among the wealthy. A daughter arrived the following year. They named her Gloria, after her mother. 18 months later, Reginald was dead. Cirrhosis of the liver had destroyed him at 45. His young widow discovered the extent of the disaster when the lawyers read the will. The $15 million was gone. All of it. Gambling debts and living expenses and medical bills left the estate effectively bankrupt. The only money remaining was a $5 million trust that Reginald could not touch, to be divided between his two daughters from 2 marriages. Young Gloria would receive half when she came of age. Until then, her mother would administer the income. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was barely 20 years old, widowed, with an infant daughter, and no resources except her child's trust fund. She did what seemed natural to a young woman of her class. She went to Europe and spent Paris, London, Cannes, Monte Carlo. She crossed the Atlantic so frequently that it became routine. Her social circle included the Prince of Wales, with whom her twin sister Thelma was conducting an affair. Little Gloria remained in the care of a nurse who had been with her since birth. Mother and daughter sometimes went months without seeing each other. By 1934, the arrangement had attracted the attention of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Reginald's older sister. Gertrude was everything Gloria Morgan was not. She had married well and managed her money carefully. She had become a serious sculptor and a patron of the arts. She had founded the Whitney Museum, and she believed her brother's child was being neglected. The custody battle that followed became a sensation. For 6 weeks, newspapers reported every scandalous detail: allegations of maternal neglect, accusations of improper relationships, testimony about drinking and parties and European princes, Depression-era Americans, struggling to feed their families, read with fascination about the dysfunction of people who had everything except the sense to preserve it. They called little Gloria the poor little rich girl. The phrase captured something essential. The Vanderbilt money had not protected her. It had made her a prize to be fought over, a source of income to be controlled, a symbol of wealth that brought attention, but not security. Gertrude won custody. Little Gloria would be raised by her aunt in an environment of discipline and structure rather than by her mother amid the chaos of European society. The trial confirmed what the public had long suspected. Wealth did not make families wise or careful or good. It simply made their failures more spectacular and more public. Chapter 9. The Palaces That Could Not Survive. The forces that would destroy the Vanderbilt palaces gathered slowly, then struck all at once. The first blow came in 1913, when the 16th Amendment to the Constitution authorized a federal income tax. For the first time in American history, the great fortunes faced systematic taxation. The Commodore had built his empire paying nothing to Washington. His grandchildren would not be so fortunate. By 1918, the top marginal rate reached 77%. Then came the war. When America entered the conflict in 1917, millions of young men left for France. The factories that had once employed immigrants now desperately needed workers. Women who had spent their lives in domestic service discovered they could earn better wages in munitions plants and textile mills with shorter hours and more freedom. They never went back. The old arrangement that had sustained the great houses, cheap immigrant labor willing to scrub floors and empty chamber pots, began to dissolve. The families called it the servant problem, as if loyalty could be purchased with slightly better wages. But the problem was not wages. The problem was that a new world had arrived, one in which working-class women had choices. Factory work paid better than service, offered regular hours, and did not require living under an employer's roof. By the 1920s, full-time live-in servants had become increasingly difficult to find. Part-time workers and day help replaced the armies of footmen and maids that had once staffed Fifth Avenue. Meanwhile, the city itself was transforming. Commercial development pushed northward along the avenue. Land values soared. The mathematics became inescapable. A single city block could support a department store generating millions in revenue, or it could support one family and their servants. The families chose revenue. William Kissam Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau, the French Renaissance mansion that had announced the family's social ambitions 4 decades earlier, fell in 1926. The wrecking crews arrived and demolished every trace of it. An office tower rose in its place. The same year, the northern section of the Triple Palace came down. William Henry Vanderbilt had built it to house his art collection and his daughters. Now it was worth more as rubble. By 1947, the southern section followed, replaced by a high-rise office building. But the most painful demolition came in 1927, when the mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the largest private residence ever built in New York City, met the wrecking ball. His widow Alice had lived alone in its endless rooms with 37 servants for nearly 3 decades. She finally surrendered and sold the house for $7 million. A week before demolition, she opened the doors one last time, charging admission for charity. Thousands of ordinary New Yorkers lined up to see how the other half had lived. They wandered through the 5-story entrance hall, the 2-story ballroom, the Moorish smoking room. Then they left, and the building came down. Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store, rose where the mansion had stood. The transformation was complete. Where one family had once displayed its wealth, thousands of customers now purchased goods. The private palace had become a public marketplace. The gates that had once guarded the entrance were salvaged and installed in Central Park, where they remain today. The massive fireplace went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Fragments of a vanished world, preserved in public institutions because no private family could afford to maintain them. One by one, the Fifth Avenue mansions fell. The Astors, the Fricks, the Huntingtons, all sold or demolished. By the 1950s, not a single Vanderbilt mansion remained on Millionaire's Row. The avenue that had announced their supremacy now announced their obsolescence. The palaces had been built to last forever. They survived barely 40 years. Chapter 10. The Last Vanderbilt. She was 10 years old when the newspapers turned her into a symbol. The custody battle that would define her childhood had made her famous for all the wrong reasons. A little girl with a fortune and no one fit to raise her. By the time Gloria Vanderbilt came into her trust fund at 21, she had already learned the central lesson of her family's history. Money could buy everything except happiness, stability, or love. What happened next should have been predictable. The pattern had repeated for 4 generations. Vanderbilt heirs inherited fortunes, spent them recklessly, and died having contributed nothing. Gloria had every reason to follow the same path. Instead, she built something. In 1976, she partnered with fashion manufacturer Murjani to create a line of designer jeans. The concept seems obvious now, but at the time, no one had thought to put a famous name on denim. Gloria's jeans were different. Tighter, more flattering. Designed specifically for women's bodies rather than adapted from men's styles. Her signature was embroidered on the back pocket. A small golden swan marked the front. The first television commercial aired in 1978. By the end of that day, every pair the company had manufactured, 150,000 of them, had sold out. Within 2 years, the brand was generating over $200 million in annual sales. Gloria Vanderbilt had done what no Vanderbilt since the Commodore himself had managed. She had created wealth rather than merely spending it. She told the New York Times in 1985, "I'm not knocking inherited money, but the money I've made has a reality to me that inherited money doesn't have. As the Billie Holiday song goes, Mama may have and Papa may have, but God bless the child that's got his own." The irony was exquisite. The great-great-granddaughter of the man who had built America's railroad empire had found her fortune in blue jeans. The family that had spent decades building palaces to prove their worth now had their names stitched onto the backsides of working women across America. The Vanderbilts had finally become democratic. But even Gloria could not entirely escape the family curse. Financial troubles, lawsuits, and untrustworthy advisors eventually consumed much of what she had built. By the time she died in 2019 at 95, the fortune that newspapers had once estimated at $200 million had dwindled to approximately $1.5 million. Her son Anderson Cooper inherited almost all of it, a sum that represented less than a month of his CNN salary. Cooper had made his own fortune the hard way. After graduating from Yale, he talked his way into war zones with a borrowed camera, selling footage to anyone who would buy it. He covered famines in Africa and conflicts in Bosnia. Eventually, CNN hired him. Today, he earns approximately $20 million per year. His net worth exceeds $60 million, entirely self-made. "My mom's made clear to me that there's no trust fund," Cooper told Howard Stern in 2014. "There's none of that, and I don't believe in inheriting money. I think it's an initiative sucker. I think it's a curse. He has said he does not intend to leave substantial inheritances to his own children. They will have their college paid for. After that, they are on their own. The wheel has turned completely. The Commodore built a fortune of $200 million, the equivalent of hundreds of billions today, and left it to his descendants expecting them to multiply it forever. Within 4 generations, his great-grandchildren were bankrupt or nearly so. The mansions were demolished. The railroad was sold. The name that once commanded Fifth Avenue became a brand on discount jeans. But perhaps this is not a tragedy. Perhaps this is exactly what the Commodore would have wanted. He was, after all, a self-made man. He despised his sons precisely because they had not earned what they inherited. He understood, better than any of his descendants, that wealth without purpose is poison. His great-great-great-granddaughter figured it out. His great-great-great-great-grandson figured it out. The Vanderbilt name survives not because of the palaces or the railroads or the enormous fortune, but because 2 people decided to earn their own way. God bless the child that's got his own.